Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at this lovely board right here. This is the Aorus GA-AX370 Gaming K5. It's a Gigabyte motherboard provided by Gigabyte, so this is a review sample, and that was in cooperation with alza.co.uk. So huge thanks to them for getting me this board. And, well, they're a, big European internet store for everything computer hardware, including some extreme overclocking goodies, as well as things like delidded CPUs and bin CPUs. So you might want to check them out if you're interested in those kinds of things. But I think most of you are probably interested in this board right here. So let's take a look around it. We're not going to go too far. Well, I don't know. We'll see where this goes. So there's your I/O, which the webcam is having a lovely time with. You get a PS/2 port, two USB 2 port. Well, actually, I'm not sure if these are USB 2, but these yellow ports are they have their own 5-volt buck converter that converts 12 volts down to 5 volts. Apparently, it's supposed to give you cleaner 5 volts power, and it's meant for like if you have an external DAC powered over USB, that's what it's meant for. I think I'm gonna end up I'm gonna try get scope shots of that compared to like regular USB port 5 volts, because I'm not sure, I don't think it's as effective. I don't like, if your power supply puts out clean 5 volts, I can't see this being helpful. Now, obviously, if you have a PSU which has absolutely trash 5 volt regulation, then yeah, this will help. But if you have a good PSU, I have to wonder how useful this actually ends up being. And you get some USB 3 ports, USB 3.1 and a Type-C, HDMI, more USB 3, Intel Gigabit LAN. So this does have an Intel NIC, which is awesome, in my opinion. That's actually one of the things I really like about this board. Then you have the more USB 3.0, I believe. And then you have your audio connections. So that's that in the back. Then, right in this area, you get a 4-pin RGB header. I don't know a damn thing about RGB, so that's what I'm going to tell you about that. There's a main BIOS, a backup BIOS, so this board has dual BIOS, which I think Gigabyte is the only manufacturer that has a lot of dual BIOS boards on AM4, so this is a pretty cool feature. Then this chip, wait, where did the screwdriver here? There. This chip right here, that is a dedicated clock gen for BCLK overclocking. So basically that replaces the standard 100 megahertz clock gen that is actually found right over there. Well, that's your oscillator for it. Normally, AMD AM4 CPUs have a 100 megahertz base clock. You cannot adjust it because it's fixed frequency, but there's this chip right here which gives you a adjustable BCLK, so that's pretty cool. It does cause all kinds of issues if you start messing with that, like past a certain frequency you need to change PCIe connection speeds so that it doesn't get screwed up and all that. But it is still a really cool feature to have if you're into really fine-tuning your system, because without it, you can't do a damn thing to the BCLK at all. Like, you can't even change it by 1 megahertz. Whereas with this, if you know what you're doing, you can get all the way up to 140 megahertz BCLK. Though at that point, basically everything on the motherboard starts not working. But, you can totally make screenshots of your system running 140 BCLK. So that's pretty cool. Next to that, you find a PCI 1X slot, then a PCI 16 slot that is actually by 16. There's some PCIe switches right above that. Then you have an M.2 slot, a 1X PCIe slot again, then a 16X slot. This one shares its lanes with this top one. These two share lanes. So if you put a GPU in this one and this one, well, if you put an 8X, if you put anything in this one, this will go down to 8X, and this will be also 8X. So, yeah, and also the M.2, I think, shares with this slot. I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't really care that much. Then you have another PCIe 1X slot and another PCIe by 16. This one is wired by 4 and runs off of the chipset. So that's that. Also, here's your Intel Gigabit NIC chip. And under this, you have the audio stuff. But I didn't bother pulling off the shield for that because, well, not that important in my opinion, but well, not that interesting. I don't know anything about audio, so it's a Realtek ALC 1220 chip, so that's pretty much all I can tell you. There, now you have a front, down here on the edge, you have the front panel audio connector, SPD-IFO out, LED demo header. So this is because board has a ton of RGB. If you're demoing the board, you can plug that in and it'll RGB the board up without actually powering anything else on it. Then you have a 5-pin RGB header. I have no idea what the difference between a 5 and a 4 is, but this one has 5 pins, that one has 4. I assume there's some significance to that. You have a COM port, trusted platform module, USB 2, USB 2, USB 3, system fan header, this one with water pump support, so it probably prefers staying at 12 volts or something. You get a clear CMOS jumper, don't really have the space on the desk, but you have a clear CMOS jumper right above the front panel connector, front panel connections right here. You also, because this board doesn't have a postcode, there's no postcode on here, so that kind of sucks. So to give you sort of the bare minimum of debugging, troubleshooting equipment, Gigabyte has put 4 LEDs right above the front I/O header here, which those light up if you have they'll indicate if you have a CPU, memory, GPU, or boot device problem. So boot device would be, if your hard drive's not being detected or something, that should light up. Memory, if your memory is causing issues, that'll light up. If the CPU one lights up, then either your CPU is dead or your board is dead, one of the two. And if the GPU one lights up, your GPU might be dead. So yeah, that's pretty handy. It's not, it's not as useful as having a proper postcode, but then on Ryzen, I've not really noticed that, using the Tai Chi, I've not really noticed that the postcode was particularly helpful, because most of the time it was a case of these settings either work or it throws the F9 postcode and they don't work. So, yeah, I think this is sufficient for a motherboard not specifically targeted for, extreme overclocking or anything. Then you have your SATA ports as well as SATA Express. There's 8 SATA ports as part of that includes the ones as part of the SATA Express thing. And up here you have a USB 3.0 header. Then you have this light bar thing here, which is it looks pretty cool in my opinion. Though it has no functional purpose. 24-pin power for the motherboard, another fan header right here. And that covers that. 4 memory slots with RGB in between the memory slots again, which that's standard for Gigabyte boards, I think. And then you have 2 more fan headers up here, and an 8-pin over here. I think that pretty much covers all the basics of the board. So, let's look at the actual VRMs here, which, starting with the most important one. This one right here, vCore VRM. So the heatsink that this actually comes with is pretty substantial. So I'm not sure, the MOSFETs aren't great, but it is still obviously designed to look good, but it does seem to have a decent amount of surface area. So hopefully it does a halfway decent job of cooling the VRM. I will be testing that. As that is something that, this being a 4-phase vCore VRM, that is a pretty important, that's pretty important in my opinion for a board. And the actual MOSFETs used are on semiconductor, 4C10 high side, 4C10N high side MOSFETs, 4C06N low side. There's 2 low side FETs per phase, one high side FET in each phase. The gate drive voltage on this motherboard is straight 12 volts, so that actually gives these MOSFETs a bit more efficiency, because on 5 volts, these are terrible. On 12 volts, they're really not that bad, actually. So if you're going to be running an 8-core and pushing about 100 amps of current under, typical loading, VRM operating at 300 kilohertz switching frequency, which actually this VRM doesn't go below 300 kilohertz. It goes from 300 to 450 kilohertz on the ISL 95712 voltage controller. So that's an intercell chip. Integrates some of the gate drive. Goes 300 to 450 kilohertz, and what else was there with it? That's it. Oh yeah, it's a 4+3 phase voltage controller. I mean, you don't double into a 4. Nobody does that. Except like I hope nobody does that. Doubling a 2-phase voltage controller is just no. Please don't. But yeah, so this is a 4-phase VRM, and with 300 kilohertz, 12-volt gate to source voltage, you're looking at this VRM producing about 16 watts of heat, pushing 100 amps at 1.42 volts to a Ryzen 8 core. If you're running a 6 core, you would be looking at a current draw around 80 amps, at which point the VRM would produce 12 watts of heat. And for a 4 core, again 1.42 volts, 60 amps, you'd be looking at around 7 watts of heat. So for a 4 core, this is not an issue, but that is true for basically every motherboard ever for Ryzen. Like the 4 core CPU just doesn't use that much power. The 6 core and the 8 core, especially the 8 core, depends on like how effective is this heatsink, and how good is the thermal pad. And I will be testing that, because that is a pretty important metric for a motherboard that is, you know, on X370, and this is not a cheap motherboard at 141 pounds. So it's kind of disappointing to see a VRM that Gigabyte uses this VRM all the way down into like into their really cheap B350 boards. And the thing is, you know, it's like this board's a lot more expensive. So the only thing that makes this that could possibly make this V-Core VRM acceptable on this board is the bigger heatsink. So we'll have to test that because, well, this is not this is not super efficient. It's also pretty dense because ultimately the VRM, like, obviously, you know, this heatsink is designed, I think, for the gaming 5 and the K7. And those boards stretch the VRM a bit, you know, out a bit more, and that gives you a lower thermal density and obviously better VRM thermals. So, yeah, it's not a good VRM, okay? But with the heatsink that Gigabyte has put on it, I'm hoping that it isn't a complete fiery disaster. And we will be testing that because, well, ultimately this might end up in my personal rig, so I want to know if that's actually a good idea or not. For the SoC for the SoC portion of the VRM, which is these 3 phases up here, you're looking at a single 4C10 and a single 4C06. So 4C06 still on the low side, 4C10 on the high side. This, you know, pushing about 30 amps at 1.25 volts. Wait, 1.25 volts? No, 1.2 volts, damn it. Mistaken the notes. 30 amps, 1.2 volts, you're looking at about 4.5 watts of heat output on that. And quite frankly, this heatsink is ridiculous overkill. Well, the SoC VRM shouldn't have any issues with thermals. I don't think this heatsink is actually ridiculous or overkill, but the SoC VRM really shouldn't have issues, as you do find the SoC VRM on a lot of motherboards with similar specs in terms of Mosfets without any heat sinking at all, and those are still fine. So that's that. So overall, the VRM is really anemic. For the price point, there are definitely boards with better VRMs, but there's not any boards at this price point with a BCLK clock, like with the clock gen or dual BIOS. There are quite a few boards with the Intel NICs at this price point, as well as well, you know, the other thing is I think this board looks the best at this price point. This thing looks really good because it basically is a K7 without the K7's VRM pretty much. So, yeah, but overall, on paper, this VRM is not great. We still need to test it, in my opinion. Now then, the memory VRM, which really this one's kind of a side note. It's a single phase controlled by a Richtech 8120, 300 kilohertz switching frequency, 1.5 volts, 20 amps. You'd be looking at a heat output of around 3 watts. And 20 amps for DDR4 is actually a ton. Like, DDR4 generally pulls about 5 watts a stick, so that 20 amp figure for this single phase VRM is way overshot. It's probably never ever going to put out that much, like, it's probably never going to pull that much, well, you're probably never going to push that much current through it, even if you have all 4 memory slots occupied with like 16 gigs of RAM each per slot. And, well, at that point, Ryzen's memory controller is going to complain very loudly about it, but the memory VRM really, that's not an issue, you know. So yeah, and you do get this OC button, which I recommend not using. I imagine that puts some terrible automatic overclock on the board. So yeah, that's in that area as well. So the memory VRM, you know, non-issue, but that's never been an issue really. And then the vCore and the SoC VRM. SoC VRM, again, non-issue, but the vCore VRM, I think for 8-core CPUs might be an issue. For 6-core CPUs might be an issue. For 4 cores, it should be just fine. And the thing is, Gigabyte does also have that, like, if you actually look at how the VRM is cooled, you end up with this situation, and I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that this could mess up the VRM thermals, and if you were to actually use the board's I/O shield, I think that would be that would definitely, in my opinion, end up messing with your thermals, because if you had a, you know, downdraft air cooler and you did still have the I/O cover, because to be completely honest, I think this looks great, and you had a downdraft air cooler, as long as you don't have a, you know, as long as you don't put the I/O shield on the back of the board, you have all this empty space for air to get through the heatsink and out the back of the board. So, well, I don't have a case to test in, but I will do, you know, on the test bench testing with the board, and we'll see how well the heatsink does. I mean, it's not exactly designed for, you know, having a lot of air go through it, but I'm hoping that it's not too bad. What else is there that I wanted to mention about the board? Oh, right. All the capacitors everywhere on this motherboard are APAC, so that's a Taiwanese capacitor manufacturer, and they're rated for 5,000 hours at 105 degrees centigrade. So basically, when I do my VRM stress test, you know, when we do the VRM testing, actually, target temperature is to stay below 105, because, well, that's where ultimately the Mosfets really don't care about running at 105 degrees centigrade. All the capacitors on the board actually do. So as long as all the basically the capacitors have to stay below 105. The Mosfets, I don't really care that much. Well, Mosfets would be fine all the way up to, say, even 125, so they're non-issue. Inductors are basically just a bit of wire encased in a magnetic material, so they don't care either, but the capacitors are a pretty major concern. And that's pretty much that's it, I think. That's the physical overview of the board. You know, I'm hoping that it doesn't do too badly in actual testing, because I do like the feature set of this board, like the dual BIOS, the clock gen, awesome. I kind of wish it had a postcode. I kind of wish they didn't go with the silly overclock button and gave you real proper, like, power and reset buttons. That would, yeah, but at the same time, like, this VRM really isn't targeted at isn't targeted at overclocking that much. I'm sure you can do it. I don't think it'll be, we'll see how it actually fares, but yeah, it's kind of a interesting mix. Like, everything feature-wise, I really like the board. VRM-wise, well, hopefully the heatsink, you know, saves it. But as far as the Mosfets go, this is really not good. Like, this is not great. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below. If you have any questions, you can leave them down below. Suggestions for testing, you can leave them down below. What else is there? If you would like to support what I do here with Actually Hardcore Overclocking, I have a Patreon, PayPal, there's also shirts. You can find all of that down in the description below. And one last thanks to Gigabyte for sending this board over, as well as to Alza for, you know, facilitating that. So that's it, and goodbye.